So, welcome, Dr. Githua.
Thank you so much.
Good to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. Yeah.
It means that the world has peace.
At least, let's hope so.
Okay.
But not really, yeah. I get you.
Dr. Edgar Githua is an international relations, peace and conflict researcher and a security analyst. He's our guest because we are talking about what's happening globally. The leaders of the world are converging in New York, our president included, and they are talking about world peace and the future and harmonious coexistence and all those other things that they talk about. The United Nations General Assembly, the 79th edition, is taking place this week in New York. How neutrality can lead to economic and humanitarian crises in Africa. I'll welcome you with the day's proverb, courtesy of CT. Today, this week, the proverbs will be from Senegal. Today's proverb, give us your interpretation of it.
Yeah.
It is better to travel alone than with a bad companion. It is better to travel alone than with a bad companion. Kwanza kama unapanda mlima.
That is, it's no pun intended. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good proverb. It's true because there are people who are vision killers. You have a dream, you have a destiny you want to get to. And if you have the wrong companion, they actually become destiny killers because they keep discouraging you from taking challenges that probably you feel it's time for you to take. They keep watering down whatever you're thinking of doing. So sometimes the lonely path is the way to success. Because if you have the wrong companion, someone who doesn't bear the same vision that you have, they will definitely pull you down because of their own fears, and fear can be contagious. In fact, the English say misery loves company. So yeah, because they are miserable in their situation, they'll pull you down because they do not want you to go ahead of them. And yeah, I agree with that proverb. You'd rather be alone sometimes to make it in life. Yeah.
So interpretation is about to become a thesis.
Sindio?
Yeah.
Naona vile imeenda.
It's deep, eh?
Sheesh.
Yeah, it's true, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, people can be vision killers sometimes, yeah. There you go.
The United Nations General Assembly is happening.
Yes.
Right? In New York. And so this week we're going to see President standing there and speaking. Does it matter?
Thanks. That's a nice question, Latiff. It does matter. It matters because when the presidents speak, they'll be pretty much giving us the global, it's like the triage of telling us where the globe is and where the world is in terms of global politics, what the main issues are, what the world is grappling with. So you'll have presidents and if you watch those speeches, if you have the time to watch those speeches, and they can be quite long and, tedious. Some will be talking about security issues. Some will be talking about climate issues. A majority of them will be talking about reforms at the UN because they feel, especially from the global south, you'll hear African presidents and the global south talking about how the UN system is not fair to the African countries and to the global south. So there'll be a number of issues, but you can expect peace and security, food security to be issues to be talked about. Definitely the Russian-Ukraine invasion will be feature high on the agenda, Israel-Hamas, the Sudan conflict in Africa. There'll be all those things. And of course, you will also have what reforms are coming into the UN. Where are we at the reform agenda? How is Africa and the global south being given an equal footing in the United Nations? Because it is a big boys club, truth be told.
Is it anything more than a talk shop?
That's a question my students keep asking me in class. Does the UN work for everyone? That's a better way of asking that question. Truth be told, the UN has, let me use a Swahili pun, let me use a Swahili statement, Ikona Wenyewe. The UN has big boys. It's a big boys. There are people who own the system. There are people who control the system. And hence, it will be used to further their agenda. In as much as 193 countries each have an equal vote at the General Assembly, there are some countries that are more equal than others within the United Nations system. And that is the truth. That is a bare naked truth. Yeah. So to an extent, some countries will be allowed to come and vent and others will listen. But there'll be some people who will caucus and decide this is the global agenda and whip people quietly behind the scenes until things are moving in a particular way that they want.
Is this across sectors? Because we're looking at UNGA as of course the annual meeting of states.
Yeah.
But what you're saying now is that then number one, it is a talk shop. And number two, there are those who make the decisions about what the globe is going to do, or how, the trajectory that it's going to take.
Yeah.
So it's a global waste of time?
You can't call it that. It is from the UN General Assembly, and over the years, many resolutions, impactful resolutions have come up and really helped. The fact that the world gets to meet together, remember the whole aim of the United Nations, why it was formed was because number one, it was to avoid world wars, conflict and world wars, exactly. It was a place to try and give us all an equal footing to try and say the world we want to live in and how we want it to be.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is not a waste of time. The problem comes in when some agendas are sensitive to the interests of some particular powerful countries. Hence, those agendas are slow punctured, or they slow down in those debates. Because, for example, let's take just something, let's take reforms at the UN, where the world keeps on saying, why do we have 5 countries holding veto power and literally controlling the fate of the world on so many issues? Why only 5 countries? Why these particular countries? Why can't we open up that space? And so, the other day, the United States of America said, we are willing to allow African countries to have 2 seats at the Security Council, so long as they do not have veto power. The veto power is everything. So if you give us seats at the Security
So you can
Council,
sit at the table, but you will not eat the meal.
Exactly.
Right.
Your decisions
You
will
can
not
eat,
have...
but the drumstick is...
yeah.
You can't touch
The
the
neck.
drumstick.
Yeah. The imondo belongs to somebody
Yes.
else. Yeah. So it's those debates. So
it's counterproductive, or it's counterintuitive to what the United Nations in the very first place was formed to create. Because if we were looking, because yes, indeed, it was to stop, because we were coming out of World War I, World War II, and then, the world came together and said, no, come on, guys, we need to be able to have a place where we do kumbaya at a global level, and that we do not have these horrific conflicts that we've seen. But if everybody was supposed to have this neighborhood feel and a place at the table, this now where we say certain people set the agenda, certain nations make the decisions, it's counterproductive to what it was supposed to do in the first place.
exactly. And that's why you find this global frustration, this wave of global frustration, because countries feel like we will go there, we will vent, we will say whatever it is that we want to say, but are we being listened to? All right? Are our thoughts being taken to account? Are our ideas being taken to account? Why do we have the global north dictating the agenda? Those are some of the debates that are actually outside there. So I will not call it a talk shop. I have not fully given up on it. Mine is just an appeal to, can we have, and I know I'm sounding very idealistic. There's a theory called there's idealism. It's very idealistic to think that the world is equal. All right, that is the place we'd all want to be at. But the truth of the matter is, there are global powers out there that dictate the agenda, and unless things are flowing in their direction, they will pretty much every once in a while, without telling you to your face, slow down the debate or derail the debate, and you will speak and not get to the promised land that you're really looking forward to getting. Yeah.
Let's look at the situation in the globe right now.
Yeah.
Okay? So in Europe, they have a conflict.
Exactly.
Russia, Ukraine. In the Middle East, there's that conflict that's going on there. In Africa, we have our conflicts. West Africa, we have issues. The Horn of Africa, we have issues. We have issues around us.
Yeah.
Now, are those crises being treated equally? Are they being looked at equally in the lens of the United Nations?
Thank you. In theory, all conflicts should be treated equally, in theory. In practice, we have seen something different. And I'll give you an example. Africa has been suffering from a food crisis, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Now, because of the dire need and the food insecurity Africa has been facing for a long time, when the Russian-Ukraine conflict broke out, a lot of aid that was coming towards Africa started getting diverted towards that conflict, almost showing us that some conflicts are more equal than others. All right? Why the Russian-Ukraine conflict is given a higher preeminence, so to speak, is because of the ripple effects and the global shocks it sends. Russia invades Ukraine, fuel prices of the world go up. We get a food crisis of global proportions all over the world. So we have prices of wheat, soya, fertilizer, shocks all over the world.
Energy crisis.
The energy crisis and all those things. Now Europe gets into an energy crisis. Now Putin, because the European Union is supporting Ukraine, he turns off the gas taps to Europe. So you will find, so the world naturally realizes the Russia-Ukraine conflict probably has a bigger impact in the global food chain, the global energy chain, as opposed to a conflict in Africa. And not at the risk of sounding like I'm demeaning it, and I am not. The conflict in Sudan, global powers ask, who is that affecting? Okay, it's creating a refugee crisis in Africa, in the Horn of Africa. But other than that, who else is it affecting? So when they tick those boxes and realize we are still buying and selling, our stock markets are still operating, it will not be given the same attention as the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A conflict in the Middle East, if, for example, the Israel-Hamas conflict spills over outside the borders, the Middle East, what is it known for? Oil. That is another energy crisis the world is looking at. So you'll find, unfortunately, because of some of the geopolitics around this conflict, some conflicts will be ranked higher, or they'll be deemed to be a little bit more important than others because of what the repercussions the world is going to feel. And that is just the way it is. Lives are lives, they're all important, but granted, because of the effects to global powers and the world economy, some parts of the world, if they're in problems, the world really suffers. And that's why I think in the global order and hierarchy of which conflicts are more important, you'll find those ones, a lot of attention being drawn to and a lot of discussions going into trying to stop some of those conflicts.
But don't we see that the real issue here, Doc, is that the conflicts whereby the world's leading powers would have some kind of influence of interest is the ones that would get some attention.
Correct. You're very right. Now, for the Security Council, let's look at the Security Council. And that's a very nice question, too. Because for some agendas to be discussed at the Security Council, they must have the backing of these global powers. Otherwise, your agenda never sees the day. So imagine where you need to get your problem sorted out, and the people who are deciding what we are going to discuss, we are going to solve, let's say, 5 problems per day. If these global powers do not feel your problem touches any of your interests at any given time, it doesn't get airtime.
Or their interests, for that matter.
That's the thing. So it doesn't get airtime. And this is now why people have been clamoring for reforms at the United Nations. We want reforms. We want to have an equal voice. We want all agendas to be equal. We want all parts of the world to be viewed as equal. Whatever problems are occurring in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia Pacific, they should be equal to what's happening in Europe, in Southeast Europe, in Eastern Europe. That is basically the call.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's unrealistic, isn't it? Like we just said earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unrealistic to expect that they're going to be treated the same way.
You're right, Latiff, to an extent. But if we push, and I'll introduce a new angle, if we push, for example, let me take the African scenario. Africa has realized it has one big asset. Other than our minerals, other than our raw resources, the African vote, the 54 votes we have at the UN, 55 votes that we have at the UN, is now something that these global powers have discovered. Hey, we need those votes. So you'll have the Russia-Africa Summit, China-Africa Summit. We have now all these big powers, Italy-Africa Summit. Now they have realized if we can try and get Africa to back our agenda in global politics. So now we've now become what do we call? We've become
the
now,
bride.
we've become nice brides who can be wooed now.
But you see, now that's where the problem again comes. That everybody can see the power of the 54, and the 54 can't see the power of the 54.
Of the 54.
Thank you.
See, that was actually going to be something I was going to touch on.
Yeah.
That when the United Nations came into being, 45, 46, that everybody was, again, having a flower moment. Kumbaya, yes, the world has come together and we formed now this club where we can all come and discuss things. And, then we developed a little bit more, and then we started to see conversations about regional bodies coming together, whether you had NATO or OAU or the EU, things like that started coming into conversation. We didn't really have pushback to what many would call a pretentious way of global politics that was now embedded in the UN. We didn't really have pushback to that because people were still dazzled by this new shiny toy that was this group where you could all come to New York, the New York address every now and then.
Yeah.
We started to see the pushback when it was very clear that some kind of state sovereignty was something you could discuss at whatever level. When countries gained their independence and started to see that you could actually build and make and do for yourself, is when we started to see pushback to some of the things that you're talking about and started to push for reforms at the United Nations. So now when nations see that actually we can make a difference, why do we then not see that pushback comes on a glaring level? If 54 African nations are not able, for example, to see the power that they have to not sit at the table, for goodness sake, create their own table that would do much more for this kind of negotiation that we see that happens at UNGA in New York every year.
Yeah.
Are we really playing in global politics, or are we sitting in the audience watching these guys play?
Beautiful question. Remember, when the UN is being formed, African countries are colonies. We are still colonies. So when they are dividing the cake and setting out the agenda, we do not feature. The UN helped African countries to become independent eventually. Of course, it clamored for that. And African states became independent. But we became independent and came to the table to be told, this is the way things are done. This is how it is. Welcome to this club. These are the rules
of the club.
These are the rules of the club. You're the newest member.
So to sit in the corner and
sit there and first learn. And then you've mentioned something called state sovereignty. I'll add something else, state interest. One of the biggest problems with African countries, I would say, is our lack of unity. Even though we have the African Union, we do not allow the African Union to speak for us. You still have African states that want to chart their own agenda, almost independent of the African Union. And I'll give you a good example, and at the risk of some people throwing stones at me later on, I thought there was a gentleman's agreement, or there's been a push in the African Union that so that African can negotiate from a position of strength, why don't we allow the AU to represent African states in some of these big dealings? But guess what? When Russia calls Russia-Africa Summit, 17 presidents quietly, others say African Union represent us, 17 say no, I will go and represent myself. So why can't we all be united? Why can't Africans be united? Gaddafi tried to unite Africa and he paid a price for it.
Funds the AU, let's be honest here.
Yeah, the European Union.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right now, even looking at we can't even fund our own thing that was supposed to come out to be a representation of the continent.
Yeah.
Can we really then depend on that same body
That's it.
to represent us if we can't even fund it for ourselves?
So the question becomes, African countries want to be members of the African Union. They don't want to pay the subscription fees. You do not want to pay. You do not want to fund it and make it strong to give it teeth in global politics. How else then are you going to? How else is it going to stand and fight these other big powers? The African Union is funded by a little subscription, the European Union, well-wishers like China, the US, and if they do it, they will dictate your agenda. So
then when we go to UNGA, when you go to UNGA, like you will in the next couple of days, the agenda set on the table, you're not going to have a say, really, in terms of what's going to be decided.
Yeah, it will be big politics, what we call high politics, military issues, of course, the global wars, climate change, and Africa's voice, of course, like right now, Africa is really clamoring for climate financing. It's talking about we should reform the World Bank and IMF and get loans at cheaper interest rates and all that. But, hey, we'll be like, get your act together. It's our money. We are the ones who are contributing the money. Countries like the US contribute between, on average, 15 to 20% of the UN budget. So that country has a lot of power within the UN system. If they withdraw their funding, like Trump had threatened to do some years ago, the UN feels the jitters.
Yeah. Dr. Edgar Githua, international relations, peace and conflict researcher and security analyst. So the world is talking about all these things and saying, we shall look at how we can all continue singing Kumbaya. There's a push for a change, reforms in various sectors, reform in the global financial architecture, reform in the way the UN is meeting at the Security Council, reform that. Think about the future. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, has asked leaders to come together so he can host the summit of the future, looking at the future and how the world is going to look like. But if all these things are not sorted, this future thing is future in different people's perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, it will be a future where people keep on kicking the ball or kicking the bucket to the next 20, 30 years, not my monkey, not my circus kind of situation. You're right. He's identifying new threats, the use of AI. He's looking at food security and how it threatens. For example, he's looking at how the UN is seemingly looking very, very ineffective because it has not been able to deal with the Russian-Ukraine conflict decisively. It has not been able to deal with the Israeli-Hamas issue. How the Sudan conflict in Africa is now dragging on and created a humanitarian crisis. So many people, 10 million people. I mean, a refugee crisis of epic proportions. So Guterres, I think, he's giving a clarion call out there saying that if you do not feed people, for example, he has identified food insecurity, especially in places like Africa, as one of the biggest challenges, because he's saying if you do not feed people, you are starting conflict. You are brewing conflict. We say in English, a hungry man is an angry man. So when African governments, or when you have food insecurity in Africa, we're talking about revolutions around the corner. If you go back into history, the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, one of the issues other than bad governance was on food prices. You touch food, you touch people's bellies, they're going to go to the streets. So there is a bit of urgency, a clarion call, and urgency. We need to sort out, allow Ukraine to export those grains. With that, Ukraine is a breadbasket of very many parts of the world, Russia included. So we need to sort out that, if not for the sake of war and the lives being lost in Russia, Ukraine, for the rest of the world because of the food insecurity that is occurring and all these things. So I know he has a tough job on his hands. Guterres, remember, when you're the SG of the UN, you're also working there and hoping that these big powers will support you in whatever agenda that you have. So we wish him well. It's not going to be a walk in the park for him.
But nobody's singing his tune. Okay, well, people are saying, we shall attend the summit of the future. But everybody's coming there to see how they can manipulate this whole conversation.
Particular agenda.
In their favor.
Exactly.
Right? Now, what should the African countries... Is it possible, first of all, in your opinion, for the African countries to actually have one voice? There's 54 of us. When you talk about like food insecurity, it cuts across. When you talk about we are going to be the most populous in the world in coming years, cuts across. We're going to be the youngest. It's us, all of us as Africans.
It's true.
So why is it not possible for us to go and say, you know what, for the sake of our future and how we want this world to look like, because we are the leaders of the future, this is how we want to shape it?
That's a very good question. Number one, and I say this and I tell students and I say this to audiences where I'm given a chance to say it. Africans are their own worst enemies in this sense. Very brilliant ideas, but poor execution because of lack of political goodwill. Question: why, for the love of God, after the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine conflict, when we realize how vulnerable we are to these disruptions and shocks in the food chains, why would someone play around with fertilizer when it's supposed to go to farmers? Are you getting what I'm saying? Without going to, that's a discussion for another day. Why would someone in their right mind play around with fertilizer when it's going towards food security? So I have a view that lack of political goodwill in executing or making Africa food secure, I think for me is the biggest problem. Even before we go into our unity and how we'll speak as one voice, individual African countries, I'll take you back to Malawi some years ago, in the 2000s. President Bingu wa Mutharika, he comes up and says, Malawi is not going to beg for food again. And he heavily subsidizes fertilizer and seeds. Of course, he gets castigated and he gets ostracized by global powers. But he did it until Malawi became a net exporter of grains in the South African belt. Malawi, that was now asking for food aid, was now exporting grains. that model, which agriculturalists came to call a green revolution, is something that all countries in Africa can copy-paste, all right? Ignoring our brothers and sisters who live in the Sahara Desert, in that Sahel region, everybody else, sub-Saharan countries, if we all decided we are going to make agriculture a priority in our countries, and not only use it, not only, Eric, there
not as a buzzword.
Yeah, not as a buzzword.
African leaders have decided.
Yeah.
They've actually sat down and looked at what do we need to do. And they've said, yeah, we need to put a lot of our budget into agriculture.
Yeah.
And they sat down. Where was this? Was it Malabo? And they said, let's dedicate, the amount of money that goes into agriculture.
Exactly.
But
the execution.
Okay.
The execution. The political goodwill. In Kenya, for example, we have what that irrigation scheme of ours, Galana Kulalu, 100,000 acres or so. Why can't people get it right? Why can't people just have the political will to get it right?
Well, even the ones that existed before. Yeah.
Exactly.
When I was going to school, we were actually studying very many of these irrigation schemes.
Exactly.
Wire irrigation scheme, Pekera irrigation scheme, I don't know why.
Yeah.
Those ones have collapsed.
That's the thing. So my point is, we have found ourselves, COVID-19 pandemic hit everyone, the Russia-Ukraine conflict hit everyone. But then the bigger question becomes, now that we have seen how vulnerable we are, what are African governments doing about just making the continent food secure? Literally sitting down and putting your budget and putting the right people, appointing the right people into those dockets who know what agriculture is and what is required so that they can make a difference. And this is what I'd say. If only 10 countries, if we can have, this is just if we can have Zimbabwe. Remember what happened in Zimbabwe? Uncle Bob.
Yes.
Yeah, he came and nationalized those white farms.
Exactly.
That was a breadbasket, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, and brought in people who didn't know what to do about agriculture. Zimbabwe, we get Zambia, we get Malawi. Kenya can also get into that bandwagon. DRC, South Sudan is one of the most fertile countries on the African continent, but now they are a rentier state. They rely on oil instead of putting money into agriculture. If we can just have 10 African agricultural giants, we can feed the continent. And whether there's a conflict outside there, yes, it will affect us in different ways, but at least we will have food on the table. Why don't African governments do this thing? That's one of the biggest questions I ask. And it is that lack of unity on some of this, and the African Union not leading this agenda and actually whipping African countries to do this, that makes and leaves Africa vulnerable to all these negative shocks that we get. Today it's Russia, Ukraine. Tomorrow it's going to be something else. Then we're going to be like, we can't get Brazil. If Brazil has a problem, we get our sugar from there. Yeah. Ndu can't have her tea and coffee with sugar. Yeah. So why are we leaving ourselves vulnerable as a continent to all these global shocks when we have the arable land, we have the requisite human resource and capacity? Because in Kenya, for example, we have very advanced and very educated agricultural economists and you name it. But why aren't we doing the right thing?
I almost hear you saying as though, Edgar, that the UNGA, the assembly, more often than not, presents an opportunity for African nations or those who live in what I usually don't like calling, but all right, the global south, to revisit the position of power and geopolitics where we currently are. Yeah. And with the strengths and resources that we have, look at UNGA every year as an opportunity for us to reevaluate the position where we sit at in a global
you're
space.
Right. You're right. But now coming back to Latiff's main, you see this neutrality. Now coming back now to what he was talking about, that neutrality. African states have gotten into a position whereby they don't realize that being neutral and trying to play Mr. Nice Guy will eventually get you into so many other problems. Because when you decide, I will not condemn Russia because of this, because I'm afraid they will not give me grain and give me support. I will not condemn US actions, Israel. I will not condemn Israel. Playing nice in global politics, you end up losing at the end of the day.
Yes.
You end up losing. You need to take a position and stand in your position. So, for example, traditionally, who have been our traditional partners, and I'm not here and I'm not here holding brief for any of them, of the big powers. You try and ask yourself in global politics, if it is not broken, don't fix it. There is that saying that says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
When you start playing geopolitics at a level and at a scale that you're not ready to play at, you get stamped on. So, for example, you'll find certain countries, when there are resolutions to condemn Russia because of its invasion in Ukraine, some African countries decide they are going to abstain. Not because they do not know what moral is the right thing to do, but because they are afraid that Putin will come looking for them, that Putin is going to touch them, or he's going to withdraw aid, or whatever it is that he's promised you, without realizing that he does not care. Let me give you an example. Six, 7 African countries, literally led by South Africa, went to Russia to tell the African Peace Initiative, to tell Russia, please stop invading Ukraine. We want to broker peace. Africa wants to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. Guess what? Putin ignored them. When they were talking to Zelensky in Ukraine, Putin, to drive a point to show them, Africa, I do not care about your voice, he bombed Kyiv when they were there. So I do not care about your voice as Africa. So you can't afford to be neutral on some of these things. Take a stand, take a position, and push, because good guys finish last in international politics. If you go there without a stand, if you think that by appeasing these big powers that they will favor you, they will not get favored. They will do whatever they want to do. It is their interest first. So neutrality, like Latiff was saying, is going to cost us.
But maybe
Neutrality
that's a
doesn't
stand.
help us,
No. You speak as if being neutral is not a stand. That's a stand. That's a stand, Edgar. Look, if you look at these two big powers, it's not just Ukraine and Russia.
Exactly.
It is East-West. It's a whole different conversation.
It's a Cold War revisited,
Yes.
kind of. Yeah.
And there are those that will look at it and say, if I vote with Ukraine, I am basically supporting NATO
West, yeah.
and the
West,
US.
yeah.
Do I agree with the position that NATO and the US have taken? So if you haven't agreed with the position that NATO and the US have taken,
Yeah.
what do you do? And also at the same time, you don't agree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
What do? You take your own stand.
Exactly.
Which may be what those African countries did.
Yeah.
Our stand is we don't support NATO, US, we don't support Russia. We are going now to say, you guys, we don't support any of you. We want to broker peace. We want you to come back to the
And
table.
then what do? I hear you and I agree with you, Latiff. I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
That being neutral is also a stand.
Yep.
But then this is what happens. Both East and the West begin to look at you as the enemy. Because you're...
So that's the thing.
Now we're suffering. Now we end up suffering.
But that's a position you take.
That's the thing.
Are you telling us that we should abandon that position because we are being looked as enemies?
No, I'm not saying that we should abandon, but we need to have, we definitely know, we need to take a stand.
That's a stand.
The stand is being
We don't
neutral.
care whether we are looked at as enemies. We have our own stand,
Because
which does not align
And my
to
argument-
this side or that side.
And then my argument now...
There are more than two sides to this coin.
And my argument now becomes, by taking that neutral stand, you are left out. Both of them, nobody wants to come to rally to your cause. Nobody thinks you're supporting any of their...
But does it have to be?
We
But this
stood
is the
on
thing.
principle.
Stood on something.
Yes.
But then I think we can't run away from the unique position that Africa holds because of the resource-rich and the human resource-rich position in which we stand.
Yes, exactly.
And then I think that the reason why we continue to be treated like the orphan little brother somewhere in the corner is because we do not realize, or rather we do not take full possession of the resources that we actually do have. And because of that, that's why we always have to be in a begging position whereby we say, well, I've got to stand with Russia or I've got to stand with the US because then that means I will be included in geopolitics. No. And that's why I do agree that, look, don't take a seat at the table, create your own damn table. And that's why we're saying that today it has to be a place.
Yes.
I mean,
Right
that
now-
has got to be something that you do. That's why when you go, and I think if you do that over time, that when you do go to UNGA, somebody's going to be saying, hang on a minute,
The African voice has come.
Yes.
There you go.
I think it was rather unfortunate that it was just a few countries from Africa that took the stand that those ones were taking. It's just a few countries, led by South Africa, for example, that has taken a clear stand on Israel. When it comes to the position of the other African countries on Israel, we are wishy-washy. The other day, Kenya abstained from a vote. The other day, which countries voted with Israel, the other countries voted against Israel. And come another vote. Look,
You see,
if this 54 took a stand and decided, all right, on the matter of Israel, Palestine, Hamas, the neighborhood, Middle
This is
East
the
peace.
African position.
This is our position.
Uh-huh.
And they rally one another towards it because the other countries rally each other towards our position.
Yeah.
Then it's clear.
But do you know why we never get there? Divide and rule.
Because of what you're saying, that we should not take it's not neutrality, it's a third position.
That's that third position. Someone will make sure you never get that third position. Quietly behind the scenes, whipping, a lot of lobbying. We promised you aid. You guys asked us for this. If you want us to support you, and that's how world politics, global politics occurs. It's very unfortunate. And it is quid pro quo, scratch my back and I'll scratch yours.
Yeah.
On this position, when it comes for vote at the UNGA, kindly support my cause. If you don't, that aid that you're looking for. The hole we dug ourselves into, all right? The same people who are supposed to pull us out of that hole tell us terms and conditions apply. If you want aid, support my position on this. On this issue, when it comes for voting, can I hear your voice? On some others, you're even advised and told, kindly abstain. Yeah, appear neutral. Because we know there's something you've been looking for. Russia has promised you some few ships of grain. Because we don't want you to lose it, but we also need you on this other side, you abstain on this one.
So you can't beg and have a voice.
That's the whole point. You can't have your cake and eat it in global politics. You're not at that level to have your cake and eat it. That's why sometimes being neutral, you'd rather die on one side, all right? And at least those ones pray to God that they will come to your aid on some things. But this neutrality, in my view, is making some people even get you're trampled on more.
Edgar, let's look at some of the things that preclude one from being at that level where you don't have to beg. And this is at the international level now.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that these nations have in common whereby they can actually cough and the rest of the world gets, the flu?
Yeah.
Or, sniffle and the rest of the world gets the flu.
Yeah.
And we're looking at there's a number, there's a G87, whatever number they want to call it tomorrow. But what are some of the things that they have done? They've achieved economic success. They've achieved economic independence. Whereby this thing you're talking about, feed your people, is not a problem. They're not worrying about feeding their people.
Exactly.
That's not an issue for them. They're not worrying about their economies and what kind of money they command. I mean, it's huge stuff that we're talking about. And those seem to me to be some of the two things that will preclude anybody else from having a seat at that table.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So one would say, if you want to be in a position whereby you have a voice, you must have one or two of those things.
Military strength, economic strength,
independence and
exactly,
strength.
those two.
Right.
If you're not a mover and shaker in the global economics, who are you?
So are we saying that it's about time then that nations started to strive for those things? If you strive for those things, that puts you at the top of the table in this world game.
Exactly. We are what? What is Africa? We've been told this by economists. We are more of a consuming kind of economy. We don't manufacture. What do we manufacture as Africa?
People.
Where we have, good human resource. And even then, there's another term for it. It's called brain drain. Even it's our capacity, but whose economy is it building? It's a brain drain. It's going to build the rest. So in my view, you want to have a seat at the table. Where is your military power? Where is your economic power? Who are you? What do you have to offer? I mean, when the US speaks, when China coughs, the whole world catches a cold. Literally, no pun intended, okay? Because of who they are, their size, their GDP, the military strength, their global influence and reach. When Kenya coughs, who listens? Who are you? That is a question. In international relations, that is a question. Who are you in the global hierarchy of power? And that determines your voice and where you stand. So, going back to what you were talking about, the solutions, if African countries can now start leveraging on saying, as a continent, we have 1.3 billion people. We are rich in resources. Why can't we leverage our resource, the fact that as Africa has 1.3 billion, that is a market that these big countries need to sell their goods. And then we rally behind and speak in one voice. But when we have these differences between the Anglophone and Francophone countries, I want you people to watch the vote that's going to come up for the AU chairmanship. And remember, it's that whoever eventually becomes the chairperson of that AU commission is speaking for Africa, is doing this for the benefit of Africa. But I want you to watch the it's called what? The night of long knives, and what is going to happen around that.
But the line's already drawn. We already see the lines drawn.
Exactly, they're already drawn. Instead of now approaching this thing and saying, look here, whoever takes it, it's a win for all of Africa. But now it's become a win and death, a life and death issue. Okay, and global powers are going to interfere with this as well, because now for them, whoever takes it is also a big thing. Why can't Africa speak with one voice? That's a question we ask.
Because even the ones that we have as sovereign states, we want to eat it. People are stealing from each other. So, I mean, seriously speaking, our governance is all kind of upside down. How do you go as a united front, even when in your backyard there are certain things? And that's why I asked the question about what precludes African nations, what precludes the majority of us from getting to the point whereby we're actually having a conversation at that level.
Yeah.
But if you can't get your backyard in order,
there you go.
How are you? What are you?
And at the risk of sounding like I'm inciting some certain quarters of the world, when some African presidents believe their countries are their personal property or their domains, their small fiefdoms, kingdoms, yeah, they are small little dynasties. When democracy, let's not even go down that road. Yeah, I think Eric will just blow up. Yeah, we'll just piss him off.
I'm just thinking, even if you look at Europe, there are those countries that are the influencers in Europe.
Yeah.
Right? America is the influencer in North America.
Yeah.
There are countries that are influencers in the South America, Brazil. And in Africa, who are the influencers and do they speak the same language? If you look at the economic powerhouses in Africa, so Nigeria, South Africa,
Kenya.
Do they speak the same language?
You see now,
because if the big brothers are not saying the same thing, then who's going to follow them?
Exactly. And there are also those regional hegemons, as we call them, are also under siege. Nigeria is the big powerhouse in West Africa, the largest in ECOWAS, ECOMOG. But now look at what has happened in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger have gone and created their own small thing. And they are, literally showing Nigeria you're not as influential as you think you are in this region.
Yep.
So that kind of diminishes Nigeria's voice in global politics. If you can't get your own region in order, who are you to speak to us? South Africa has its own issues with, we go to Kenya, we are under siege. Rwanda wants our position. Tanzania is there.
Probably because we are, again, speaking as individual countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you imagine if South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and some countries in the Sahel spoke one language? And took this position of leading from the front when it comes to Africa affairs.
Yeah, exactly.
Then maybe it also gives you strength back home.
It's true.
You're the big boy in Africa. So whether the small guy there in Niger who's trying to misbehave, it's okay. You misbehave. Eventually, you'll come back here.
Yeah. If regional powers could, number one, close ranks, Egypt, Algeria, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, set the agenda for Africa. All right. And everybody else falls into place. Probably would get there. But the problem is, like I told you, divide and rule.
We don't operate on principle, do we really? I remember watching a documentary on the Rothschilds empire and how they really made their money.
In banking.
And some people will say there was some fraud inside there and things that happened. But there was a principle that they never swayed away from.
Exactly.
So that meant that when Rothschild himself died and his son took over and then the son died, the cousin was able to take over an uncle here because it was based on a principle of success that they knew this is what we are going to have to do, come rain, come sunshine. And that, I think, is what allows you to say that South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, whatever, okay, maybe Egypt, okay, but to come together and say, look, it is on principle that we've understood this fundamental thing whereby we know that there's something that we have in common. How about we take that commonality, fight for ourselves, insist that in our backyards we're up to scratch. There's no way we cannot go forward without that. But
Definitely.
It's the principle. And if we are not consuming that principle, practicing it, living it out, we have a very, very, very long way to go. Where do we push for such things?
And two, the next question now, the spanner in the works. Will global powers allow us to get our houses in order? That's the other debate. Because now, obviously, everybody sees if these 1.3 billion people speak in one voice, we have problems. Exactly. You get what I'm saying? They'll deny us the gold. They'll deny us oil, access to their markets, raw materials, the resources in DRC Congo. So is it in someone's interest to make sure that unity never really occurs? Gaddafi's dream of a United States of Africa. Who else can pick up that mantra and go champion it?
Who's willing to die?
Who's willing to be killed?
Yeah, who's willing to take the bullet for us? Okay, there you go. So we have all these things, and but we shouldn't give up. We don't give up. I think a generation is coming. The Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas, and Gen Omegas, if there'll be a Gen Omega somewhere, they will definitely get that act together, and probably Africa will speak in one voice. But that's a conversation we need to start, and we need to start having. Who will unite us? When will we learn to speak in one voice? and not get taken advantage of and not get exposed to. One. Two, all these nice plans that we have of building and creating good agriculture and becoming food secure. Why don't our African presidents and African leaders, why don't they just stick to the blueprint and do it? They know what needs to be done.
Boils down to the people. That question, don't ask why don't our leaders, why don't our people?
I get you.
If our people wanted it,
Yeah.
our leaders would have no option but to do
Definitely.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming here. Dr. Edgar Githua is an international relations, peace and conflict researcher. He's been here. We'll be talking about how neutrality can lead to economic and humanitarian crises in Africa.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.